The snow was falling harder than I had ever seen it fall in my 16 years of life, each flake hitting the ground like little frozen tears from a sky that seemed to be crying along with me. The wind howled through the bare branches of the trees that lined our street, creating an eerie symphony that made the whole world feel abandoned and desolate. I was walking home from school, my backpack heavy with textbooks I probably wouldn't touch during winter break, when I heard it, a sound so faint, so desperate, that for a moment I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and my breath came out in thick white clouds that disappeared almost instantly into the swirling snow. My fingers were already numb despite my worn gloves, and I could feel ice crystals forming on my eyelashes with each blink. The whole world looked like it had been drained of color, just endless white stretching in all directions, broken only by the dark silhouettes of houses and the occasional yellow glow of a window. But then I heard it again. A small broken cry coming from somewhere beneath the massive pile of snow that the city snowplows had pushed against the old oak on the corner of Maple and 3rd Street. My heart stopped. Something was alive down there, and it was dying. The sound was so small, so fragile, that it seemed impossible it could carry through the howling wind and thick snow. But somehow it reached me like a desperate prayer. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now? And from what city or state are you watching? I hope you're somewhere warm and safe while I tell you this story that changed everything I thought I knew about kindness. My name is Marcus, and I was never the type of kid who rescued anything. I kept to myself most of the time, headphones on, hood up, just trying to get through each day without calling attention to myself. My parents had divorced the year before, and the wounds from that separation were still fresh and raw, like a cut that refused to heal properly. I was living with my mom in a small rental house on the quieter side of town, the kind of neighborhood where people mind their own business and where abandoned things often stay abandoned. The house we lived in now was nothing like our previous home. It was smaller, older, with drafty windows that let in the cold no matter how much weather stripping my mom applied. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Patterson next door arguing with her husband every night, and the radiator in my room made strange banging sounds that kept me awake. But it was what we could afford on my mom's salary from the restaurant, and we were grateful to have a roof over our heads. My mom worked double shifts most days, leaving before I woke up and coming home after I'd already heated up whatever frozen dinner we had in the freezer. She tried to hide how exhausted she was, how worried about money, but I could see it in the way her shoulders hunched when she thought I wasn't looking, in the way she counted and recounted bills at the kitchen table late at night. I had always been drawn to animals, though I'd never admit it to anyone at school. When I was younger, before everything fell apart at home, I used to spend hours watching nature documentaries, dreaming about being a veterinarian someday. I had notebooks full of drawings of different animals, facts I'd copied from encyclopedias, and elaborate plans for the animal hospital I'd run when I grew up. But dreams like that felt impossible now, especially when just getting through high school felt like climbing Mount Everest in flip-flops. The divorce had changed everything about our family. Before, we'd been the kind of family that had game nights and took camping trips and always had pets. We'd had a golden retriever named Buddy who was my best friend until I was 12, when he got sick with cancer and had to be put down. After that, my parents said we'd get another dog when things settled down, but things never settled down. Instead, they got worse and worse until Dad moved out and took half of everything with him, including any possibility of new pets. School had become a place where I just went through the motions. My grades weren't terrible, but they weren't great either. I sat in the back of most classes, answered when called on, turned in assignments that were good enough to pass, but not good enough to draw attention. The other kids seemed to exist in a different world from mine, one where parents stayed together and Christmas meant new phones and expensive sneakers instead of carefully budgeted groceries and secondhand clothes. The snow had been falling for 3 straight days, and the whole town looked like it had been wrapped in a thick white blanket. School had been canceled twice, which should have been exciting, but mostly just meant more time alone in the house while my mom worked double shifts to keep us afloat. The silence in our house during those snow day cancellations was deafening, broken only by the tick-tock of the old clock in the hallway and the occasional groan of the house settling in the cold. I'd spent most of those canceled school days reading or playing video games on the old console that used to be in our family room, but now lived in my bedroom. Sometimes I'd stand at my window and watch the snow fall, wondering what it would be like to just disappear into it, to walk into the white and keep walking until I found somewhere that felt like home again. That afternoon, December 18th, I remember the date because it was exactly 1 week before Christmas. I was trudging home through snow that came up to my knees. The cold was the kind that bites right through your clothes and settles in your bones, making you feel like you'll never be warm again. My old winter coat, handed down from my cousin who'd outgrown it 2 years earlier, had a broken zipper that I tried to fix with safety pins, so the wind cut through me like a knife made of ice. The walk home from school usually took about 15 minutes, but in this snow, it was taking twice as long. Each step required effort, like walking through thick mud, and my sneakers, which probably should have been replaced months ago, were letting in snow with every step. My socks were soaked through, and I could feel blisters forming where my wet shoes rubbed against my skin. Most of the houses on my street had their Christmas lights up, twinkling through the falling snow like little beacons of warmth and family togetherness. The Morrison house had a massive inflatable Santa in their front yard, looking slightly deflated in the wind, but still cheerful. The Garcias had strung lights around every tree in their yard, creating a winter wonderland that looked like something from a movie. I tried not to look at them too long, because they reminded me of better times, when my dad still lived with us, and our house was one of those beacon houses too. Last Christmas, we'd barely managed a small tree from the grocery store, and a few gifts that my mom had clearly stressed about buying. This year, Mom had gently suggested that we might skip the tree altogether, focus on just being grateful for what we had. I told her that was fine, that I was too old for Christmas anyway. But the truth was that seeing all these beautiful decorations made me feel like an outsider looking into a life I used to have. As I walked past the Henderson place, I could smell something incredible floating from their kitchen window. Probably Mrs. Henderson's famous sugar cookies that she made every year for the whole neighborhood. The ones that had the perfect balance of vanilla and cinnamon that made your mouth water just thinking about them. The aroma was so warm and inviting that it made me stop for a moment, just breathing it in and remembering what it felt like to have a kitchen that smelled like love and celebration. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me that lunch at school had been a stale sandwich and an apple that tasted like cardboard. The free lunch program kept me fed, but it wasn't exactly gourmet dining. Most days I tried not to think too much about food, especially the kind of food that other families seemed to take for granted. The Hendersons were known for their generosity during the holidays, often bringing plates of cookies to neighbors, but our family had never been close enough to them to be included in that tradition. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling the snow around me in little tornadoes that stung my face and made my eyes water. The temperature seemed to drop another few degrees, and I pulled my inadequate coat tighter around myself, desperately wishing for the warm winter jacket I'd had to leave behind when we moved. That's when I heard it again. That small, heartbreaking sound that made me stop dead in my tracks, my feet sliding slightly on the packed snow. It was coming from the pile of snow near the old oak, the one that had been there since the city snowplows came through early that morning. The pile was enormous, probably 8 feet high and at least 20 feet wide. A mountain of dirty compressed snow that the plows had scraped from the entire street. The oak behind it was ancient, with thick branches that created a natural shelter, which was probably why the snow had accumulated so heavily in that spot. I stood there for a moment, listening hard, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The last thing I needed was to look crazy, digging through a pile of snow because I thought I heard something. What if people saw me? What if they thought I was having some kind of breakdown? I was already the quiet, weird kid whose parents got divorced, the one who wore secondhand clothes and never had money for school fundraisers. I didn't need to add talks to snow piles to my reputation. But then the sound came again, weaker this time. Like whatever was making it was running out of strength. It was definitely an animal sound. A small meow that spoke of desperation and pain and fear. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it away, I couldn't ignore the fact that something living was trapped under all that snow. Something small and helpless that would die if no one helped it. My heart started pounding as I dropped my backpack in the snow and moved closer to the pile. The snow was packed tight and hard, probably 3 feet high at the base and spanning the width of 2 cars. If something was trapped down there, it had been buried for hours, maybe since the snowplows came through early that morning. How long could a small animal survive in conditions like that? How long before hypothermia and lack of oxygen became fatal? I knelt in the snow, feeling the cold seep through my jeans immediately, the moisture soaking through the fabric and chilling my skin. The snow was deeper than I'd realized, and I sank several inches just from kneeling. I pressed my ear close to the pile, trying to block out the sound of the wind and distant traffic, focusing all my attention on listening for that little voice. For a few seconds, there was nothing except the sound of my own heartbeat hammering in my ears and the whistle of wind through the bare branches above me. I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing when I heard it clearly. A small mewing sound, so weak and desperate that it made my chest tighten with panic and determination. Something was definitely alive down there, and it was a baby animal. A kitten, I realized, my mind racing through possibilities. How had it gotten there? Had it been abandoned and tried to find shelter under the tree before the snowplows came through? Had it fallen from somewhere and gotten trapped when snow was thrown on top of it? The details didn't matter now. What mattered was that a tiny kitten was buried somewhere in this mountain of snow, probably scared and freezing and running out of air. I started digging with my bare hands, not even thinking about how the snow burned against my skin or how my fingers were already going numb. The snow was heavier than I expected, packed hard by the weight of what was on top of it, compressed into chunks that were almost like ice. My gloves were thin and worn, offering little protection, and within minutes I could feel my fingers starting to lose sensation. But I kept digging, frantically but carefully, following the sound, which seemed to be coming from somewhere near the base of the oak. I called out softly as I worked, hoping the little voice would respond and guide me to the right spot. "Here, kitty," I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm even though my heart was racing. "I'm here to help. Keep making noise so I can find you." The response was immediate, but heartbreakingly weak. A small meow that seemed to take all the energy the kitten had left. I dug faster, my hands now burning from the cold, but driven by the desperate need to reach this tiny life before it was too late. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes, my finger hit something soft. Not snow, not tree bark, but something warm and furry and alive. My heart nearly exploded with relief and terror at the same time. I'd found it, but now I had to be careful not to hurt it while I dug it out. I worked more carefully now, creating a small tunnel in the snow, following the little body I'd found. The meowing was getting stronger, which I took as a good sign, but when I finally cleared enough snow to see what I'd found, my breath caught in my throat and I felt tears spring to my eyes. It was the tiniest kitten I'd ever seen, probably no more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Its fur was a mix of orange and white, the colors barely visible through the wet matted mess that the snow had made of its coat. It was shivering so violently that its whole body was just a blur of movement, and I could see that hypothermia had already set in. Its little paws were blue from the cold, and its breathing was shallow and rapid. But it was alive. Barely, but alive. And looking at me with the most beautiful blue-green eyes I'd ever seen. Eyes that held a mixture of fear and hope that broke my heart and filled it at the same time. The kitten's eyes were barely open, and they were the most beautiful blue-green color, like the ocean in photos we studied in geography class. But they were also filled with fear and confusion, and when it looked at me, I felt something crack open in my chest. This tiny creature had been abandoned and left to die, just like I sometimes felt abandoned and forgotten. But unlike me, it couldn't save itself. It needed someone to care, someone to fight for its life when it was too weak to fight for itself. I'd never felt responsible for another living thing before. Not really. Even when I was little and begged for a pet, my parents always said no. That pets were too much responsibility, too expensive, too much work. And after the divorce, the idea became even more impossible. But looking at this tiny, helpless creature that would definitely die if I didn't do something, I felt a surge of purpose I'd never experienced before. This wasn't about wanting something anymore. This was about being needed, about being the difference between life and death for someone who had no one else. For the first time in over a year, since everything fell apart with my family, I felt like I mattered, like what I did in the next few minutes could actually change the world, at least for one small life. Very gently, I lifted the kitten into my hands. It was so small it fit in my cupped palms, barely the size of a baseball, and I could feel its little heart beating like a hummingbird's wings against my fingers. The kitten tried to meow again, but barely any sound came out, just a whisper of air that might have been its last breath. Its body was limp and cold, and I realized I probably only had minutes to get it somewhere warm before it was too late. I unzipped my coat as much as the broken zipper would allow and tucked the kitten inside against my chest, hoping my body heat would help warm it up. The kitten's little body felt like ice against my shirt, and I could feel it trembling not just from cold, but from fear and exhaustion. Then I grabbed my backpack and started running home, slipping and sliding through the snow, my heart pounding with fear that I might be too late. The 3 blocks to my house felt like 3 miles. Every step was a struggle against the deep snow, and I had to fight to keep my balance while protecting the tiny life pressed against my chest. The kitten wasn't moving much anymore, which terrified me, but I could still feel that little heartbeat against my ribs, so I kept running, whispering to it the whole way, telling it to hold on, that everything was going to be okay, even though I had no idea if that was true. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs felt like lead weights, but I pushed myself harder than I'd ever pushed before. This wasn't about me anymore. Wasn't about being tired or cold or scared. This was about a tiny life that depended on me, that would live or die based on what I did in the next few minutes. By the time I reached our front door, I was gasping for breath, and my hands were shaking so badly from the cold and adrenaline that I could barely get the key in the lock. When I finally managed to get inside, the warm air hit me like a wall, and I realized how cold I'd gotten during the rescue and the run home. When I burst through our front door, my mom was in the kitchen, still wearing her uniform from the restaurant and looking exhausted after another long shift serving coffee and comfort food to people who probably tipped better than they treated her. She looked up from the pile of bills she was sorting, probably ready to ask me about school or remind me to do homework. But when she saw the panic on my face and the way I was clutching my coat, her expression changed immediately. "Mom," I said, breathing hard and probably looking half frozen. "I found a kitten. It was buried in the snow, and I think it's dying." The words tumbled out of me in a rush, and I carefully opened my coat, revealing the tiny ball of barely moving fur pressed against my chest. When my mom saw the kitten, her whole face softened in a way I hadn't seen since before the divorce. She was always tough, had to be to keep us going after Dad left, but animals had always been her weakness too. Before the divorce, she was the one who always brought stray cats home, who fed neighborhood dogs, who cried at every animal movie. "Oh, honey," she whispered, reaching out to gently touch the kitten's head with one finger. The poor little thing. We need to warm her up immediately. For the next hour, my mom and I worked together like we hadn't worked together in months. The stress and exhaustion that usually defined our interactions disappeared, replaced by a shared sense of purpose that reminded me of how we used to be when we were a complete family. She sent me to get towels from the bathroom while she called our neighbor, Mrs. Chun, who used to be a veterinary technician before she retired. I wrapped the kitten in the softest towel I could find, a blue one my mom usually saved for company, while my mom prepared a shallow box with more towels and a heating pad on the lowest setting. We worked together with a coordination that felt natural and right, each of us knowing what needed to be done without having to discuss it. Mrs. Chun came over within minutes, her gray hair covered with snow and her eyes bright with concern. She'd been our neighbor for 3 years, but we'd never been close, just the occasional wave and polite chat about the weather. But when my mom called her about the kitten, she didn't hesitate for a moment. She examined the kitten carefully, her experienced hands checking for injuries and signs of hypothermia. The little thing was so weak it could barely lift its head, and its breathing was still shallow and rapid. Mrs. Chen's expression was serious as she worked, and I found myself holding my breath, afraid of what she might tell us. She has severe hypothermia and is dehydrated, Mrs. Chen explained, her voice gentle but honest. But she's young and strong. If we can get her body temperature up gradually and get some fluids into her, she might make it. But it's going to be touch and go for the next few hours. Touch and go. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I'd saved her from the snow pile, but I could still lose her. The thought was unbearable. This tiny creature had already become so important to me in just 1 hour that the idea of losing her felt like losing a part of myself. My mom made an improvised incubator in our living room, moving the coffee table aside and setting up the box with the heating pad near the fireplace. We took turns sitting with the kitten, monitoring her breathing and temperature, using a dropper to give her small amounts of warm water mixed with a little sugar for energy. As the hours passed, I found myself completely absorbed in caring for this tiny life. I'd never felt so focused on anything before, not on school, not on video games, not even on the basketball I used to love before everything changed at home. Every small breath the kitten took felt like a victory, and every time she opened those beautiful eyes, I felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, she was going to make it. The kitten's breathing gradually became less labored, and her shivering started to calm down as her body temperature slowly rose. Mrs. Chun showed us how to check for dehydration by gently pinching the skin on the back of her neck, how to monitor her heart rate, and what signs to look for that might indicate she was improving or getting worse. I learned more about animal care in those first few hours than I'd ever learned from all my childhood documentaries and books. This was real, immediate, life-or-death knowledge that I absorbed like a sponge because failure wasn't an option. This tiny life depended on me getting it right. Around 10 that night, something amazing happened. The kitten, who I'd started thinking of as Snow because of where I'd found her, lifted her head on her own and let out a small but clear meow. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard, like a little bell ringing with life and hope and gratitude. My mom, who had been dozing in the chair next to me, opened her eyes and smiled the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. "That's a good sign," she said softly. "I think she's going to be okay." The relief that flowed through me was so intense that I felt tears spring to my eyes. Snow was going to live. This tiny creature who had been dying in a pile of snow just hours earlier was going to survive, because I had stopped to listen, because I had cared enough to act. But even as relief flowed through me, I realized we had a problem. We couldn't keep a kitten. Our lease specifically said no pets. And even if it didn't say that, we could barely afford to feed ourselves, much less a cat. But I couldn't bear the thought of giving Snow to a shelter. Especially not in winter when so many animals ended up being euthanized because there wasn't enough space or resources. The thought of losing Snow after fighting so hard to save her was almost unbearable. She'd become more than just a rescued animal to me in those few hours. She'd become a symbol of hope, proof that sometimes caring about something was enough to save it, that sometimes taking action could actually make a difference. I stayed up all night with Snow, watching her gradually get stronger, feeding her every couple of hours with a dropper, talking to her in whispers so I wouldn't wake my mom. By morning, she was able to sit up on her own and had even tried to groom herself, though she was still wobbly and weak. Watching her try to clean her tiny paws with her pink tongue was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen. It was such normal cat behavior, something that proved she wasn't just surviving but starting to thrive. She was going to be okay, and somehow, that made me feel like maybe I was going to be okay too. When my mom came downstairs for coffee before her morning shift, she found me asleep on the couch with Snow curled up on my chest. Both of us finally at peace after the longest night of my life. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the gentle touch of my mom's hand on my forehead, checking to make sure I didn't have a fever after spending so much time in the cold. "Marcus," she said gently, waking me up. "We need to talk about what we're going to do with her." I knew what was coming, and my heart started to sink. But before my mom could say anything else, there was a knock on our door. When she opened it, Mrs. Henderson from down the street was standing there with a plate of those incredible sugar cookies I'd smelled the day before, her face bright with concern and curiosity. "I heard from Mrs. Chun about the kitten you rescued," she said, her eyes sparkling with warmth. "I wanted to bring you some cookies and see how the little one is doing. Mrs. Chun told me what an incredible job you did saving her life." My mom invited her in, and when Mrs. Henderson saw Snow, now sleeping peacefully in her box by the fireplace, she clasped her hands together and made a soft sound of delight. "Oh, she's precious," Mrs. Henderson said. "You know, my husband and I have been talking about getting a companion for our old cat, Whiskers. He's been so lonely since our other cat died last year. Would you consider letting us take care of her?" My heart leaped with hope and terror at the same time. On one hand, I knew the Hendersons would give Snow a wonderful home. They were retired, had a beautiful house, and Mrs. Henderson was famous in the neighborhood for her kindness to animals. On the other hand, I'd gotten attached to Snow in just one night in a way I'd never gotten attached to anything before. Mrs. Henderson must have seen the conflict on my face because she quickly added, "Of course, you'd be welcome to visit her whenever you want. And maybe you could help us take care of her? I know teenagers are busy, but if you ever wanted to spend time with her, our door is always open." That afternoon, we moved Snow to the Henderson house. They had a whole room set up for her, with a proper heat lamp, special kitten food, and toys that probably cost more than my mom spent on groceries in a week. But the best part was that they were serious about me visiting. Every day after school, I stopped by the Henderson house to check on Snow. At first, I told myself I was just making sure she was okay. But the truth was that I looked forward to those visits more than anything else in my day. Snow got stronger every day. Within a week, she was racing around the Henderson house like she owned the place, chasing toy mice and climbing cat trees. Her fur filled out to be the most beautiful orange and white I'd ever seen, and her eyes settled into that gorgeous blue-green that reminded me of summer skies. But the real magic wasn't just in Snow's recovery. Something had changed in our neighborhood. Word had spread about the rescue, and suddenly people were paying more attention to each other, checking on their neighbors, looking out for stray animals and lost pets. Mrs. Chun started a neighborhood animal rescue network, with people volunteering to help with emergencies. The Johnsons, who lived on the corner, put up a little free library in their front yard, but also included a shelf for pet supplies that people could donate or take as needed. My mom started getting invited to neighborhood gatherings, something that hadn't happened since we moved here. People asked about Snow, about me, about how we were doing. For the first time since the divorce, we felt like we belonged somewhere. But the biggest change was in me. Taking care of Snow had awakened something I thought I'd lost when my family fell apart. I remembered why I used to want to be a veterinarian, and for the first time in over a year, I started thinking about the future as something that might actually be worth planning for. I threw myself into research about animal care, reading everything I could find online, and checking out books from the library. Mrs. Chun became an unofficial mentor, teaching me about basic veterinary care, and even letting me help when other neighbors brought her injured or sick animals. My grades started improving because I actually had a reason to care about school again. If I wanted to be a veterinarian, I needed to get into college, which meant I needed to take my education seriously. My mom noticed the change immediately and started talking about community college programs and financial aid with a hope in her voice I hadn't heard in a long time. 6 months after I found Snow, Mrs. Henderson asked if I wanted to help her start a volunteer program at the local animal shelter. We'd go on weekends to help socialize cats and kittens, getting them ready for adoption. It was exactly the kind of thing I would have been too shy to do before. But Snow had given me confidence I didn't know I had. The first day at the shelter was overwhelming. There were so many animals, all waiting for homes, some scared and sick and abandoned just like Snow had been. But instead of feeling hopeless, I felt determined. Every animal deserved the chance that Snow had gotten. I started spending every Saturday at the shelter, working with cats who were too scared to let people touch them, playing with kittens who needed socialization, and helping with basic care tasks. The staff started calling me their kitten whisperer, because I seemed to have a natural ability to calm frightened animals. One Saturday in late spring, about a year after I found Snow, a family came in looking to adopt a kitten. They had a young daughter, maybe 8 years old, who had been begging for a pet for months. I watched as they looked at cage after cage, the little girl's face lighting up at each adorable face, but her parents looking uncertain. Finally, they stopped in front of a cage that held a tiny orange and white kitten, probably about the same age Snow had been when I found her. This one had been brought in just a few days earlier, found abandoned behind a grocery store. The little girl immediately fell in love, but I could see the parents hesitating. "She's so little," the mother said. "Are you sure we're ready for such a young kitten?" I found myself stepping forward, something I never would have done before Snow came into my life. "Actually," I said, "young kittens can make wonderful pets if you're prepared to give them the care they need. Would you like me to tell you about what's involved?" I spent the next 20 minutes talking to the family about kitten care, sharing everything I'd learned from taking care of Snow and volunteering at the shelter. I told them about the importance of regular feeding schedules, about litter training and socialization. I shared stories about Snow's recovery and how rewarding it had been to watch her grow strong and healthy. By the end of our conversation, the parents looked confident and excited, and the little girl was practically bouncing with joy. They filled out the adoption paperwork right there, and I helped them get supplies and schedule their first vet appointment. As I watched them leave with their new kitten, I felt a sense of satisfaction I'd never experienced before. This was what I wanted to do with my life. Not just care for animals, but help connect them with loving families, and help families understand how to give their pets the best care possible. That afternoon, I stopped by the Henderson house to visit Snow, something I still did at least 3 times a week. She was now a full-grown cat, sleek and beautiful, and completely spoiled by her adoptive grandparents. When she saw me come through the door, she ran to me like a dog, purring so loudly that Mrs. Henderson laughed from the kitchen. "You know," Mrs. Henderson said, coming into the living room with a plate of cookies, "watching you two together never gets old. She adores you, but I think you already know that." I sat on the couch with Snow in my lap, stroking her soft fur and listening to her purr. It was hard to believe that this confident, healthy cat was the same tiny dying creature I'd pulled from that pile of snow just over a year earlier. Mrs. Henderson sat down next to me, her expression thoughtful. "Marcus," she said, "I've been watching you grow this past year, and I'm so proud of the young man you've become. Finding Snow didn't just save her life, it gave you purpose. Have you thought about what you want to study in college?" I had been thinking about it a lot, actually. My mom and I had been researching veterinary programs, looking at what classes I needed to take in high school and what colleges had the best pre-vet tracks. It seemed like an impossible dream sometimes, especially when I thought about how expensive veterinary school was. But Mrs. Chun had been encouraging me to apply for scholarships and look into programs that help students from low-income families. "I want to be a veterinarian," I told Mrs. Henderson. "I want to help animals like Snow, and I want to help families learn how to take care of their pets." Mrs. Henderson smiled, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. "That's wonderful, Marcus. You know, my husband and I have been talking, and we'd like to help with your education if you'd let us. We never had children of our own, and watching you care for Snow, seeing how dedicated you've become to helping animals, has been one of the greatest joys of our retirement." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The Hendersons wanted to help pay for my college education? It felt too good to be true, like something that happened to other people, but never to kids like me. "You don't have to decide right now," Mrs. Henderson continued, "but we want you to know that we believe in you, and we want to help make your dreams possible. Snow brought us together, but you've become like family to us." That night, I went home and told my mom about the Hendersons' offer. She cried, which she'd been doing more often lately, but these were happy tears. For the first time since the divorce, she looked truly hopeful about our future. Over the next few months, everything seemed to fall into place. My grades were the best they'd ever been. I was getting recognition at the animal shelter for my volunteer work, and I was starting to receive acceptance letters from colleges with good pre-veterinary programs. But the most amazing thing happened in early December, almost exactly 2 years after I found Snow. I was at the shelter one Saturday, working with a group of kittens who had just arrived, when one of the staff members brought in a tiny orange and white kitten that looked so much like Snow that I did a double take. "Found behind the grocery store on 5th Street, the staff member explained. "Same area where we found several strays this year. Someone's been dumping cats back there." As I looked at the tiny kitten, weak and scared, and probably hypothermic from spending the night outside, I felt that same surge of protective instinct I'd felt when I found Snow. But this time, I knew exactly what to do. I worked with the shelter's veterinarian to stabilize the kitten, using all the skills I'd learned over the past 2 years. We warmed her up, hydrated her, and fed her, and within a few hours, she was already looking stronger. The next day, I brought Snow to the shelter to meet the new kitten. I thought maybe seeing a healthy, confident cat would help the little one feel less scared. What I didn't expect was the immediate bond that formed between them. Snow seemed to recognize something in the kitten, maybe remembering her own terrifying start in life. She immediately started grooming the little one, purring soothingly and curling up next to her in the recovery cage. It was like watching a mother care for her baby, except Snow had never had kittens of her own. The shelter staff was amazed by Snow's maternal behavior, and when I suggested that maybe the 2 cats should be adopted together, they thought it was a wonderful idea. The problem was finding a family willing to take 2 cats, especially when one was still recovering. That's when Mrs. Henderson surprised me again. When I told her about the new kitten and how bonded she and Snow had become, she didn't hesitate for a moment. "Bring her home," she said simply. "Whiskers could use another friend, and if Snow wants to take care of her, then that's what we'll do." That's how Snow became a big sister to Luna, the tiny kitten who was so much like her. Watching Snow teach Luna how to use the litter box, how to play with toys, And how to navigate the Henderson house was like watching a miracle unfold every day. Seeing how caring for Luna seemed to complete something in Snow. She'd always been a sweet and loving cat, but now she had a purpose that went beyond just being loved. She was the protector, the teacher, the big sister who made sure Luna never felt alone or scared. It reminded me of how finding Snow had given me purpose too. Before that snowy December day, I'd been drifting through life, just trying to survive each day. But Snow had shown me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply care about something more than you care about yourself. Now, as I write this story sitting in my dorm room at State College, majoring in animal science with plans to apply to veterinary school next year, I can see Snow and Luna through the window of the Henderson house across the street. They're sitting on the windowsill, watching the world go by, safe and warm and loved. The Hendersons kept their promise about helping with my education, setting up a scholarship fund that not only helps me, but will help other students who want to pursue careers in animal care. My mom has been able to cut back her hours at the restaurant and is even taking some classes at the community college, something she'd always wanted to do but never thought was possible. Our whole neighborhood has changed too. The animal rescue network that started with Snow's rescue has helped dozens of animals over the past 3 years. We have a pet food pantry for families going through hard times, a volunteer group that helps elderly neighbors care for their pets, and a foster program for animals waiting for adoption. But beyond the practical changes, there's something different about the way people treat each other now. It's like Snow's rescue reminded everyone that small acts of kindness can have enormous consequences, that caring for others, whether human or animal, makes the whole community stronger. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd walked past that pile of snow without stopping. If I'd convinced myself I was imagining the tiny cries for help. Snow would have died, of course, but I think I might have died a little too. In the way that happens when you ignore your compassion so often that it eventually stops speaking to you altogether. Instead, stopping to listen to that little voice crying in the snow changed everything. It gave me a best friend, a purpose, a career path, and a community that feels like family. It showed me that even when your own life feels broken and hopeless, you can still be someone's hero. Last week, I got a call from the animal shelter asking if I could help with an emergency. Someone had found a litter of kittens abandoned in a cardboard box behind a restaurant, and they needed volunteers to help with round-the-clock care. I didn't hesitate for a moment. As I sat in the shelter at 2 in the morning, bottle-feeding a tiny black kitten who couldn't have been more than 3 weeks old, I thought about Snow and that snowy December day that started it all. The kitten in my hands was making the same tiny mewing sounds that Snow had made, the same desperate cries that could so easily be ignored or dismissed. But I was listening, just like I learned to listen that day in the snow. And as the kitten finished her bottle and curled up in my palm to sleep, purring so softly it was almost inaudible, I knew that tomorrow would be better for her because someone had stopped to care. That's the thing about rescue, I've learned. You think you're saving them, but really, they're saving you right back. Snow saved me from a life of just surviving, from settling for less than I was capable of becoming. She taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's an action you take every day. A choice to care even when it's inconvenient or scary or uncertain. And now, every time I hear about someone rescuing an animal, every time I see a family adopting a pet from the shelter, every time I watch Luna teaching a foster kitten how to play, it reminds me that kindness is contagious, that one act of compassion can ripple outward in ways you never expect, touching lives you'll never even know about. 3 years ago, I was just a lonely teenager trudging through snow, trying to get home without anyone noticing me. Now I'm studying to become a veterinarian. I have a community that feels like family, and I wake up every morning knowing I have work to do that matters. All because I stopped to listen to a little voice crying in the snow, and decided that one small life was worth saving. Snow is curled up on Mrs. Henderson's windowsill right now as I write this, probably dreaming about the warm house and full food bowl and gentle hands she might never have known if that December day had gone differently. Luna is right next to her, the little sister she taught how to trust humans and how to love without fear. And somewhere in the city, there are other animals waiting in the cold, other little voices crying for help, other chances for someone to stop and listen and choose compassion over convenience. I hope they find their Marcus, their person who will hear them crying and refuse to walk away. Because every life saved saves another life in return, and every act of kindness creates the possibility for more kindness. And every time we choose love over indifference, we make the world a little warmer for everyone. That's what Snow taught me in the pile of snow where her story began. And it's what she continues to teach me every day as I watch her live the beautiful life she was always meant to have. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply stop and listen when something small and helpless is calling for help. You never know what life you might save, including your own.